Chasing Valentino engages with issues of exoticism and Orientalism in the context of a romantic relationship. It tells a failed love story as a way to, among other things, show what it feels like to be an Arab in the West. Suzanne Muaddi Darraj, who was born in 1975, is a Palestinian American writer. She wrote books for adults and young adults as well. She teaches creative writing and English literature, so you can imagine that she knows some of the terms that we have been talking about in this course. And just in terms of what communities we might imagine her representing or belonging to, she is an Arab and Palestinian in the United States. She is also a second generation to immigration. That means her parents were immigrants. The story I chose, Chasing Valentino, comes from a collection of interconnected stories about four Palestinian American friends, women friends in Philadelphia, and how they grow up together into their 20s. So if, as you read this, it felt like she mentions names that you don't know, and you're supposed to know, it's because they were mentioned in other, or discussed and narrated in other stories of the collection. Most of the video will be a reading and discussion of the text with some comments, especially through how she pays attention to the place of attraction and exoticism and Orientalism in the story itself. The opening presents the main issue of the story, as openings often do. Always pay close attention to the openings. It wasn't until Alex started asking about polygamy, being married to more than one wife, that Rima got worried. This is the issue here. He's mentioning polygamy, one of the stereotypes about the Muslim world. Maybe it has its basis in reality, but this is something the West obsesses on more than it absolutely needs to. He asked with a hesitant, desperately curious expression on his face, the slight arching of the left brow, the slightly audible intake of breath as he leaned forward. She'd known it would eventually come, but did not expect it at Marian's Cafe on Market Street on a Saturday that had started so beautifully. So she knew that her identity as an Arab would come into place in the relationship, but she was hoping that it wouldn't ruin the lovely day. Isn't it true that Arabian men can marry 4 women? That Islam permits men to have harems and sergalios? No, harems and sergalios mean the same thing. They are not words that you would usually hear in conversation. They are words that have an exotic air to them. They are exciting. They suggest a very different culture, maybe a different time period, the exciting path, something out of an adventure story, and of course the opportunity to engage with a lot of women, fantasizing maybe that you were one of those sheikhs that had many wives. Intuitively knew that he added that last word to polish off the question with an intellectual coat of wax, right? He's using a very rare word, sergalios. I don't think I ever saw this word outside of this story, because I'm not an expert in ancient Muslim architecture. But he uses it to make his question not seem to be Orientalist or just rude, but instead to make it seem like he's intellectually curious. At least he had the grace to look modest. Well, Rima began, lowering her voice so that the other clientele in the cafe wouldn't hear. Muslim men can technically marry 4 women according to the Quran. But they don't really do that anymore, right? She's saying this belongs to the past. This is maybe in the dry word of the law, but the Muslim men that I know, most Muslim world men in the world right now, don't actually marry 4 women. She's saying the harems are a thing of the past. She suddenly wished she hadn't been available when he called that morning. How innocent he had sounded a mere 4 hours ago. Right? Like this curiosity about these exotic Orientalist ideas about what Islam is like makes her wish she wasn't even speaking with him. But doesn't that affect you or bother you as a feminist? Tries maybe to pit her against her culture, saying like, as a feminist, as somebody who's supposed to really care about women's rights, this needs to bother you. And like you should be on my side criticizing the Eastern world. You should be part of the Western world. You should look at the Eastern world from outside like I do. And there are a lot of historical reasons for it. It's not reducible to just sexism. Okay, it's not just a feminist issue. It's complicated. I don't really want to go into it with you. She hoped her tone sounded final, but his narrowed eyes told her the truth. He thought she was apologizing for her culture, the way that you apologize to your party guests for the burned roast and a flopped souffle. So, like, he's expecting her to represent her entire culture and even apologize for it. Like she's responsible for anything. It's a little bit like we talked about how writers represent their whole groups. Sometimes members of minority, even without actually becoming famous writers, are asked to represent everything. Speak as the Arab, speak as the Muslim. And she doesn't like it, especially as part of an intimate relationship that she has with Alex. So then the story goes out to tell us how Rima met Alex through a brother of a friend, and it tells us how she has not been working on her doctorate in sociology because she's too excited by this new relationship. On chapter 171. When she first saw him with Nabil, that's her friend's brother, he'd paused before saying hello, and she sensed the attraction. Like the thunderbolt Michael Corleone experiences in The Godfather, or the seizing of the heart her own grandfather used to say he felt upon meeting her grandmother. She could not suppress her smiles, and she felt goofy and sexy all at once. I wanted to read this passage, not just to show how exciting it was, this relationship was at the beginning, but also because it shows how she has this double identity or double sources for how she describes even something intimate as falling in love. She mentions the thunderbolt, that's a quote from a Hollywood movie, but also she quotes something her grandfather probably said in Arabic, the seizing of the heart, an expression that comes from Arabic. Both these sources are important for her own thinking about her emotions. So at the bottom of page 171, on her first date with Alex, they met at the Lebanese cafe on 9th Street, managed by the elderly slim man, his sons, and their wives for as long as Rima could remember. Over hummus and lemon chicken kebab, right, these exotic foods, at least for Americans, Rima told Alex how she'd been pulled into sociology. I want to study the culture created by war and examine how victims cope in new worlds. My interest is really coming out of the fact that my parents are refugees of war and immigrants to the States. I have no doubt about that. How her intellectual pursuits also have to do with her identity. I just sell antiques, he said, and he walked her home later that night. That's all I could find with an art history degree. You don't enjoy it? I love antiques and old things, but the job basically sucks. So we know about Alex when we talk about his characterization is that he likes old things, antiques, maybe old ideas, old images of the Middle East. He's fascinated by this idea of the Orient being still stuck in the past, one of the most important Orientalist ideas that the West moves forward but the East stays the same forever. That's part of why he is drawn to her, almost as if she's one of the antiques in his antique shop. We hear a little more about his relationship on the next page, 172, where we hear that he insisted that she cook Middle Eastern food, so rolling grape leaves, not her thesis, occupy the daytime hours, right, to make him happy. She makes Middle Eastern food, but also turns into this kind of stereotype of kept woman in the harem who has to be at the man's attention whenever he wants. Moving a little bit down, she loved the way he spoke, the way that he compressed his lips after making a point. I'm a film buff, he said once, a few weeks after the disturbing polygamy question. I collect old movies. I think you'd like them. His mouth engulfing the final M and sealing it in. What's the oldest movie you own? She asked. And he answers, and this is a very important intertext for this story, and I'll make a video available for you. The Sheikh, made in 1921. That's the oldest movie. He grinned. You'd love that one. Like you specifically. Why me specifically? Of course, she hears it's the Sheikh. It has to do with the East. Like he's expecting her to love something just because it comes from approximately the same area of the world that her parents came from. And it's not even from there. It's just a Western Orientalist version of that place. It's a Rudolph Valentino classic. Like almost like a classic would make that better. It's the movie that made Rudolph Valentino's career. A silent movie where this desert sheikh lasts after, right, lasts, that's a very sexual word. The East is associated with lust and strong emotions here. So he lasts after an English girl and kidnaps her. He keeps her in his tent and basically makes her his sex slave. All through, it's not as obvious as that because it's an old movie. They can't show a lot of details like they do today. It turns out well, he reassured her. They actually fall in love at the end. So this is sort of bad from a feminist point of view. Fall in love after he's kidnapped her? She dismissed it as a cheesy romance fluff novel plot. But Alex brought the film to her apartment the next night. She had made tabbouleh, another Middle Eastern food, another of Alex's favorites. It had consumed most of her afternoon, chopping the tomatoes, parsley, and onions into the seedling side proportions required by the recipe. She served it with mint tea, for which Alex kissed her hand and declared that he was in paradise with a houri. Again, giving a reference to the kind of the virgin that Muslim men are supposed to get in heaven. This is especially a stereotype that has to do with stories about terrorists who are promised houris in heaven, using this Arab word to make it really, really cringe-worthy reference to how he's treating her and what he expects from her. He calls her a little below in that same page. He says, "You're my houri." She only pondered those words when she and Alex were well into the film. Valentino wearing a turban, right? Valentino is not an Arab person, but he's pretending to be, and a white cloak, crept stealthily and lustfully. She recognizes the body language as how people depict some Arab men as too lustful, who wept for her stolen freedom in a corner of his tent. Watch his face when he sees her crying, whispered Alex. And she asks him after the film is over, "How many times have you seen this film?" "At least 20 times. I know everything, right?" He's really invested in it. When it was over, he wanted her opinion. "You're an Arabian," he prefaced. An Arabian is the exotic way to say the word Arab. It's not really necessarily a racist way, but it's really, really anachronistic and exoticizing. And he really loves this word. If you notice, maybe in the beginning of the story, he uses the word and she doesn't correct him. But now she's kind of getting tired from his approach to her, and she corrects him. Arab, sorry, what's your take? Like, speak to this as an Arab. What could she say to him? That she was somewhat offended by it, that it was full of stereotypes. She tried to express this tactfully so as not to hurt his feelings. He really loves this film. You must be kidding, Alex. It's horribly racist. Why is there not one decent Arab in the whole movie? What about the Sheikh himself, Valentino? He turns out to be half Spanish and half English, right? He's not really Arab, so they can make him nice at the end once he realizes he's not really Arab and he can be with the girl because he's not really Arab. And not a coincidence, I'm sure. But he's raised in an Arab culture. He's an orphan, and oh, Alex, men who kidnap women or buy them at bride auctions, that's Arab culture. Come on, right? This is not a real depiction. This is a Orientalist exoticizing depiction, and she's starting to realize that in many ways this is how Alex sees her, and asks her to be more exotic for him, and accept this image for herself. He didn't respond. You know that's racist, don't you? They didn't understand Arab culture then. And she's making excuses. This is from 80 years ago. Maybe it's not fair. Of course I know that. He kissed her hand. Let's forget it. We can agree to disagree, right? Sort of when somebody says agree to disagree, is I'm not buying what you're saying, but I don't want to argue. But here's the top of page 175. There's something really interesting that whenever he was annoying and almost racist or really racist, she just kept reminding herself of how blue his eyes were. So blue is not a very typical of for Arabs. Maybe there's a suggestion that Rima also has some kind of fascination with Alex as somebody who looks different from her. Um, in the next paragraph, we hear how since she had been old enough to understand it, she'd been bothered by the fact that people told her she looked exotic, right? Different from Americans in an attractive way, which until the age of 14 she confused with erotic, having to do with sex, and exotic anyways often has to do with sex. So it's a way to sexualize someone, sort of giving them a compliment. Oh, you look so exotic, I love the way you look, but also sexualizing and objectifying her at the same time. So the question that we are left here is, why does she stay with him for so long if he's treating her like some exotic woman that's only interesting because she's exotic? We get some kind of explanation. Let's read still page 175. Rima knew that was one major consideration despite her most logical attempt to argue with herself. But the truth was, it felt good to be with someone like Alex, because she's also interested in Alex as a type, not just specifically Alex. Someone she thought would never be interested in her, right? She has maybe inferiority feelings, just a sense that mainstream white Americans would not agree to date an Arab woman. And she's excited that somebody like Alex is interested in her. And part of the reason is that he's interested in Arab culture, someone who wasn't scared of her culture, that was in fact fascinated with it. Wasn't hesitant about leaping into something completely different. Alex's personality is such that he likes difference. He likes things that are not everyday or not typical. So that's why he can be with her, unlike a lot of other white guys. And she likes it. And she's not sure that she could find a nice white guy or a nice guy that would be interested in her for herself. Skipping one paragraph. So she didn't say much about her feelings to him, about her dissatisfaction. In a way, she was grateful, right? She is thankful for his interest in her culture, even though it's sometimes embarrassing and almost racist the way he thinks about her culture. It's nice for her that he has any interest in it. There was times when she lacked interest in Arabness, in her own Arabness, right? He's more interested in her Arab culture than she is sometimes. And there are times when she wanted to disappear and just wake up blonde and green-eyed with a live-in stockbroker boyfriend who watched football on Sundays while she read Time magazine on the couch beside him. So she's fantasizing about being someone who's not ethnically marked. This is this doubleness of feeling, maybe I don't want to be part of this culture. Maybe it's easier to be part of the mainstream white culture in America. She's imagining this very stereotypical American couple doing very stereotypical American things like watching football and reading Time magazine. on the couch. And at least with Alex, he's interested in it, and it has significance. It's not just something that ruins things, it's something that actually fascinates. So there are some positive things from her perspective on the of this relationship, but we might feel that she's lying to herself, or that it's based on lack of confidence, or about negative and ambiguous, ambivalent feelings about her own culture and background, and we want her to interrogate that a little more. Now, towards the end of the story, and his Alex's mother comes up, and she tells us, and she's much more overtly xenophobic, even racist, and eventually they break up. I, I don't want to give an overall analysis of the relationship, or an overall analysis of the entire story. I want you to sort of integrate it together, make your own judgment if she was right to break up with Alex, if Alex's behavior is okay or not okay, if her behavior is okay or not okay. I want you to, with some of the analysis and interpretation that I offered, to decide for yourself what's the final takeaway of this story. At any rate, I think it's very clear how this story shows one person facing a world where exotic and Orientalist ideas really shape the way people react to her, and the kind of people she can be with. If you remember, Deleuze and Guattari talked about how in minor literature everything gains a political dimension. I think the way Alex's and Rima's relationship shapes out is definitely one moment that illustrates this idea that even in the most intimate relationship of family and romance, identity and politics of identity come into place. Thank you for listening.